Bismillah. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you for tuning into this short reflection from the Quran. Today we're going to be covering a short passage from Juz number 8, inshallah. What I've done is I've chosen to go over the very last portion of Juz 8, and of course we're covering this book, the tafsir by Sayyid Qutb of the Quran. So the last passage of Juz 8, it spans around 5 pages. This particular portion starts at ayah 59 and goes on to ayah 93, which is actually in Juz number 9. And what this passage covers is 5 stories of 5 noble prophets: Nuh alayhi salam, Hud alayhi salam, Salih alayhi salam, Lut alayhi salam, and Shu'aib alayhi salam. And it begins with the story of Nuh alayhi salam, which I'll very, very briefly begin the recitation of. Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لقد أرسلنا نوحا إلى قومه فقال يا قوم اعبدوا الله ما لكم من إله غيره إني أخاف عليكم عذاب يوم عظيم قال الملأ من قومه إنا لنراك في ضلال مبين قال يا قوم ليس بي ضلالة ولكني رسول من رب العالمين. Now this actually goes on, Allah begins by explaining that we sent Nuh alayhi salam to his people, giving them the message, "O my people, worship Allah. You have no other ma'bud or deity other than Him. I fear for you a punishment of a tremendous day if you don't worship Him." And then the response of the elites of his society, telling him that he's in clear error. Now this story, there's a pattern. What the interesting thing about these 5 stories is a couple of things. One is that all of these stories are told in chronological order, which is not always the style of the Quran. Often Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dips into different parts of the story, and it's spread out between different surahs. So here we've got 5 continuous pages of the Quran that are dedicated to these stories, and they're all in a chronological format. Secondly, there's of course a lot of repetition and themes that emerge. There's a pattern that is established, a narrative, if you will, of the stories of the prophets. So what I intend to do is very briefly give the basic features of this narrative and then zoom into the key characters or roles that appear in each of these stories. So the overarching kind of narrative is as follows. A prophet is sent to each society. That prophet is a respected member of that society. The prophet conveys the message that he's entrusted with, and he advises his people to adopt the right way. The elites of the society straight away reject the message, and they try to discredit the messenger, and they pursue different ways and means to try and confuse the public. Most of the public follow them. The Prophet continues to advise and call his people to abandon the wrong way and to follow the right way. The elites become increasingly stubborn and they become increasingly arrogant. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down punishment on the whole society, and everyone is destroyed except the believing community from that society. That's the basic structure of every one of these 5 stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeats. Now the key characters that emerge are 4. There's the prophets themselves, then there's the believers who follow the prophets, then there's the elites of that society, and then there's the general public. And I'll quickly look at the kind of, again, key features that are told through the 5 stories that about each of them. So about the prophets, they are regarded to be part of the qawm that they are from. So the people who they are sent to, they are from those people, and those people regard them as one of their own. They come with a message, and the message has 2 aspects. One is they call people to Tawheed, Ibadah, and Taqwa, which means that everyone must believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is alone, the creator, the one who is worthy of worship, and then they must serve him. They must offer him ubudiyah and not serve any other gods besides him. The second aspect is they actually warn their people to stop the oppression or injustice or evil that they're carrying out in society. So each prophet comes with a slightly different kind of warning, but these 2 aspects are always there present in the message of the prophets. Thirdly, the they reject any false accusations that are made against them. So the elites concoct a lot of names and things, and they reject them. The prophets reject them. They also make clear to the society that they are here only for the best interest and welfare of the whole society. They say that I am a nasih and I'm amin. I'm an honest, trustworthy, sincere well-wisher of all of you, and I don't want anything in return. I'm only doing it for the sake of Allah, and I don't want anything in return. So this is the kind of role that they play and how they present themselves. They remind their community of the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them. In each of the stories, each prophet does the same thing. They also remind their community of the demise and the destruction of the people who came before, who rejected the message. And finally, the prophets remain steadfast upon rejection, threats, false accusations, ostracization, and they place their trust upon Allah. This is the pattern we see about the prophets. Second, the believers. Right, the believers are usually a small section of the public. They follow the prophet of their time, and they form a community around that prophet. They distinguish themselves from the rest of the society in terms of their beliefs and their ethics, their morals. Okay, there's actually not much discussion in these verses about them reciting or praying or fasting or anything like that, but they are distinguished from the society by adopting, believing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one with the sole authority to send down a moral code, a way of life, and usually they're in small number. Thirdly, the believers, they endure patiently along with the Prophet all the rejection and persecution that the prophets face. And lastly, about the believers, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down the punishment upon the whole society because of their rejection, the believing community is saved, and a new society is formed that is comprised of an iman-based, taqwa-based group of people, and a society, that's the foundation of which is based upon revelation. Now, the third role in these stories is those of the role of the elites. The elites are always a small group of people, but they wield a great amount of influence and power in society. They reject the message, they reject the messengers, and they steadily increase in their obstinance and arrogance. They reject the message by usually citing the rationale that we're not going to give up our ways, we're not going to give up our traditions, we're not going to give up our forefathers and what we inherited from them. What they, of course, don't say explicitly is that by giving up their traditions and their patterns of living and their way of life, they will be giving up their political and economic and other interests, which is protected by following their previous way of life. So they become hostile to the Prophet. They start discrediting him. They start calling him names. They start undermining his message. And they, particularly Allah mentioned in this passage, they call him misguided, they call him foolish, and they call him liars. So each prophet gets his fair share of this name calling. They outright rebel against any instruction of the Prophet to abandon corruption, to abandon wrongdoing. And they even start saying, if you are truly a prophet, then go and bring the punishment upon us. They use their powers of manipulation and threats to keep the masses confused about the Prophet and his message. They say things like, we are going to evict you from this society. And they say to the Prophet, you must prove, to the Prophet and the believers, you must prove your allegiance to our deen and our traditions. Otherwise, we're going to chuck you out. And they say to the public, anyone who follows this Prophet will suffer loss. So all of this type of intimidation and coercion that they use is all designed to try and stop the public from accessing the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down by the Prophet. And finally, about the elites, they never adopt the message. They never agree to follow the Prophet. So this is the pattern of the elites in these 5 stories. Lastly, the public. Now, the public actually get very little mention. And the majority of the public end up following their leaders. So they end up, passively or actively rejecting the message, rejecting the Prophet. And a small section of the public takes the risk, as we discussed earlier, and embraces the light of guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent via the Prophet. And due to their rejection of the message and their blind obedience to the elites, the majority are destroyed along with the arrogant leaders. And Allah talks about different types of destruction He sends. He sends earthquakes, He sends stones from the sky, and He sends floods and other things. Each time this is the same pattern. Now, the key thing we have to take away, there's so many lessons from this passage, but just a few key points. Firstly, all the prophets came with the same message. They are one community, therefore. We, the Muslims, have inherited their legacy, and we need to continue their mission. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how is our lifestyle, how is our life purpose in connection to that mission? How are we actually living up to that ideal? How much of our worldview is influenced by the Quranic narrative? What are we going to be doing this Ramadan to access the Quran and see the world through its eyes? And finally, I'll end by saying that the unchanging roles, these patterns that the story tells, are actually going to be there until Yawm al-Qiyamah. And the elites will always oppose the message. The masses will always follow the elites. The believers will always begin as a minority, and the believers will always be rejected by society. And finally, the believers will always prevail. So the question we need to ask is, have we got our scales, correct? And who do we identify with? Do we see the world through this paradigm, or are we looking at it from a different paradigm and confusing ourselves? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us, inshallah, to the truth. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us ability to take inspiration from the stories and the sacrifices of the prophets that came before us and the believers who we are all connected to with a spiritual bond, with the imani bond. May Allah enable us to benefit from this month of Quran, to access its great lessons and insights. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.